Hello, I'm Gordon Lane, editor of CameraLabs.com. I'd like to give you a brief video tour around the Nikon D40x digital SLR. Here it is, the D40x, and if it looks familiar, you're not going mad. This is essentially identical to the earlier Nikon D40, except with one big difference: the resolution. The Nikon D40 has 6 megapixels, the D40x has 10.2. It's fair to say that a lot of people who are after an entry-level digital SLR went into the shops, loved everything about the D40, but thought perhaps the 6 megapixels weren't enough in a market dominated by 10 megapixel models. So Nikon, only 4 months later, brought out the D40X, equipped it with a 10.2 megapixel sensor, and now it's ready to really compete. The sensor inside this camera is in fact exactly the same as the one you'll find in the higher-end Nikon D80, and as such it brings the D40X a couple of extra benefits. First of all, the ISO sensitivity range is a little bit wider than on the D40. Here it starts at 100 ISO, whereas on the D40 it starts at 200. The D40X also has slightly faster continuous shooting, 3 frames per second instead of 2.5 on the D40, so there's a couple of benefits to this sensor other than just higher resolution. But otherwise, it's essentially the same camera as the Nikon D40. It's very compact but very well built. Even though it's very small, there's a decent sized grip, plenty to hold on to there. It's also remarkably good at judging a scene. It's really good at metering and working out the correct exposure for you. It's also very easy to use, and I've got a demonstration of that right now. The D40X uses its 2.5-inch screen in exactly the same way as the D40. By default, it presents the exposure information both numerically on the right and graphically on the left. Now we're in aperture priority mode at the moment, and if I adjust the F number here, increase it by turning the dial, you can see not only does the number increase, but this iris graphic on the left hand side actually shrinks down. And this is a graphical representation of what's really going on inside the lens. And it's just one of the many ways that the D40X, like the D40, makes things easier for beginners, especially beginners to digital SLRs. You'll also notice a flashing question mark in the bottom left corner. This means the D40X is trying to tell me something, so let's press the question mark button and see what it's trying to say. It's saying that the lighting is poor and perhaps we'd be better off firing the flash, and this is yet another way that the D40X makes life a lot easier. If it thinks something is going to go wrong, it'll tell you about it. Now this graphical representation of exposure is just one of a choice of a couple of ways of presenting this information. If I press the menu button, we can actually change this to a more classic format. Let's have a look at that. This looks a lot more like the kind of screen you get on top of a higher end digital SLR. You've still got the F number and the shutter speed, but it's presented in a more classic format. If we go back to the menu here, you'll see it's even possible to select wallpaper, an actual background image of a photograph that you took earlier. Let's see how that looks. So there you are, photograph of the beach to remind you of happier times, and still your exposure information here. Like the D40, you've got the main shooting information running down the right hand side of the screen and also below it. Now if you want to adjust any of these settings like the ISO or the white balance, you have to first of all press the info button in the bottom left corner. This highlights the top aspect here, it's saying fine, this is referring to the quality. Then you use the joystick to actually move around and choose the thing that you want to change. So if you want to change the ISO, we move the highlighter to the ISO section, press OK, and this, and only at this point, can you actually change it. You'll see here that the big difference with the D40X is that its sensor allows 100 ISO instead of 200. But like the D40, you also still get these little thumbnail examples of when you might use these different settings, so it still makes it very easy. If you want to change the white balance, for example, we can go up there, highlight it, press OK, and choose a different white balance, and again we've got the thumbnails on the left hand side giving us examples of when you might use those. It's very easy to use, but it is slightly slower than digital SLRs, which actually give you buttons for direct access to these settings. So if it's something that you think you're going to be changing more often, then perhaps you should be looking at a camera like the Nikon D80 or perhaps the Canon 400D XTI. Let's have a quick look at Playback. If we press play, you'll get a picture that we took earlier, and if I press the up button, we can display various bits of information. This would normally be showing flashing highlights if there are any clipped areas, and this shows a brightness histogram. Like the D40, it's also possible to display an RGB histogram by applying one of the colour filters. If I press the OK button, we can get the filter effects menu up here, choose colour balance, and there we have our RGB histograms. And here we can actually also change the colour balance quite significantly. So it's nice to be able to have this degree of sophistication on what's really an entry-level camera. By equipping the D40x with a high resolution sensor, Nikon has arguably made an already good digital SLR even better, and certainly the D40x gets a lot of benefits inherited from the earlier model. It's compact, it's light, but the build quality is still very good, comfortable to hold. The legendary Nikon metering system is rarely fooled by any situation. You can point this camera at almost anything and it just isn't fooled. And of course the high resolution sensor really does record greater detail. Pretty much the same as the D80, which isn't surprising considering they both now got the same sensor. But it's not all good news. There are a few things that were really quite basic about the D40 that have now been inherited by the D40X. For example, the 3-point autofocus system. It's fine for normal use, but if you're into taking pictures of subjects that are moving all over the frame, you'll be better served by the more sophisticated 9-point autofocus system of the Canon 400D Rebel XTI. The XTI also has a couple of other benefits. For example, it also has a depth of field preview. You don't get that with this camera. You have easier access to things like the ISO and white balance. Again, the D40X, like the D40, makes you go through a few steps before it lets you change things like that. And perhaps most importantly of all, the D40X, like the D40, will only autofocus with the latest Nikon AFS lenses. These are lenses that have got the autofocus motor built into them. Older lenses actually relied on a motor inside the body, which is no longer here in the D40 or the D40X. So if you're after this camera for budgetary reasons and you want to maybe go out and buy some cheaper older lenses, they may only be manual focus with this camera. So these are all things that we were willing to forgive on the D40 simply because it was a cheaper camera and it was so easy to use for beginners. But with the D40X, you're paying about an extra $200 US or an extra 100 British pounds for that high resolution sensor, but still those basic features. It also inevitably starts you thinking about maybe spending that bit more and going for the D80 instead. Now that is quite a lot more expensive, but it is a much more sophisticated camera. So the D40X kind of sits between these models. If you really loved the D40 but just wished it had high resolution, then the D40X is the camera for you. But if you think that spending a bit more money is going to get you a more sophisticated camera, then perhaps you should steer clear of this and consider the Canon 400D XTI, or better still, the Nikon D80 instead. As always, this video represents a very small part of a much larger review, so if you want to see some example shots from the D40X, how it compares against the Canon 400D XTI, and of course its predecessor, the D40, and to find out much more besides, then make sure you check out our full review. It's at www.cameralabs.com.